Let's go back to 1989, November 1989, which I mentioned, end of Soviet tyranny. If anybody believed the propaganda that they had heard for the last 50 years, they would have predicted that NATO would disappear. I mean, the justification for NATO was it's protecting the West from the Russian hordes. Okay, the Russian hordes are gone. What happens to NATO? It should have gone as well. Did it? No, it expanded. And that teaches you something. Actually, what happened in detail is quite interesting. Gorbachev made a remarkable concession to the West. He agreed to let Germany form a united Germany, join a Western military alliance, a hostile military alliance. Now, if you just look at history, it's pretty clear what an amazing concession that was. I mean, Germany alone had almost destroyed Russia several times in the preceding century. And now Gorbachev was saying, okay, united Germany can be rearmed and can join a hostile military alliance, which makes it much more powerful. Well, of course, there was he thought he made an agreement. He thought that the West, meaning the United States, was agreeing not to let NATO expand to the east. The phrase was not 1 inch to the east, meaning NATO would not extend to East Germany and, of course, would not extend further. And also, he thought he had a promise that NATO would become a more political organization. So the President Bush and the Secretary of State, James Baker, did promise that. They promised NATO would become a more political organization. It would not extend 1 inch to the east. However, Gorbachev made a serious error. And if any of you are intending to take on a course in diplomacy, you might pay attention to it. He only got a verbal promise. He thought it was a gentleman's agreement. You don't make gentlemen's agreements with savage, violent powers. So they made sure not to write it down. It was never written in words. It was just a gentleman's agreement. We have no doubt about what was said. Helmut Kohl said the same thing. Genscher said the same thing. Yeah, we promise not to extend 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened? NATO immediately expanded to East Germany, and under Clinton it expanded much farther through Eastern Europe, right up to the borders of the Soviet Union. Well, Gorbachev was pretty upset, naturally, and the Russians reacted. There was more. Gorbachev had offered a nuclear weapons-free zone from the Arctic down to the Mediterranean. The U.S. didn't even consider that. It wasn't even discussed. And NATO has, in fact, expanded. Well, it's now not only going to the east, the happens to be Dutch Secretary General of NATO announced about a year ago that NATO has to take responsibility for the entire global energy system. So it has to what's called protect, meaning ensure that we own the sea lanes, the pipelines, and so on. And there was just a conference about 2 weeks ago in Washington headed by former Secretary of State Albright, which had a new, I forgot the name of it, it had a new mission for NATO to expand worldwide. Well, NATO is a US-run military force, and it's now becoming an international, global US intervention force. And the purpose of it, one purpose of it, is to, exactly as the questioner said, to integrate Europe into the US-dominated military system. That's what NATO was for in the first place. One goal of NATO from the very beginning was to block Gaullist initiatives, to make sure that Europe would not move in an independent course. And as the pretext for NATO disappeared, namely the Russians, we can now see what it's all about. Now NATO is expanded. No Russians, but it's expanded to a global US-run military intervention force in which Europe is absorbed. Now, Europe is dragging its feet. It's not doing it enthusiastically enough. And about a week ago, there was an important article by Richard Haas. He's the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's kind of like the main non-governmental foreign relations establishment institution. He's a former high policymaker. The title of the article, which appeared in the London Financial Times, if you want to look it up, the title is "Goodbye Europe." It says, Europe is no longer playing its proper role as a major actor in world affairs because it's not violent enough. Meaning, the point is Europe is refusing to provide sufficient military force for the US-run global programs of controlling, the world by force. So goodbye, Europe. You're not violent enough, so we don't want you anymore. We'll take somebody else. Actually, he doesn't really mean goodbye, Europe. It's just chastising Europe for their failures to have an adequate commitment to violence. But you still have to be absorbed in the US-run system.